The outline of the talk is going to be the following. I'll have a look at two critiques made quite recently by Arash Abazari in Hegel's Ontology of Power and by Frank Ruder in the book Hegel's Rebel, or Hegel's Pöbel in German, first published in German. Then we'll have a look at the method that these authors and critics of Hegel imply and compare it to Hegel's own understanding of what philosophical method looks like. And then I will have a look at two possible Hegelian responses to the criticisms leveled by Abazari and Ruder. The first one will be just kind of hedging your bets, dogmatic kind of Hegelian reply that kind of just retreats back into the structure of the philosophy of right and more or less repeats what Hegel is saying against neo-Marxist critics. And then the second reply is the more experimental, non-dogmatic attempt to try and think together with neo-Marxist institutional reforms, trying to substantiate, sticking to the method of the philosophy of right, to substantiate this notion of right with neo-Marxist institutional proposals, to then see whether there's any kind of common ground that can be found between neo-Marxist institutions, the institutions Hegel proposes, and maybe some quite widely popular liberal critiques of Hegel. So the two critiques are, as already mentioned, Arash Abazari, Hegel's Ontology of Power, published in 2020 with Cambridge University Press, and Frank Ruder's Hegel's Rebel, 2011. Both of these authors agree, maybe in a not very surprising manner, given that they're neo-Marxist by their own naming, that Hegel is wrong about the normative validity of capitalist civil society and its relationship to the state. Both authors make empirical and conceptual points against Hegel, and both raise the issue of philosophical method. Arash Abazari thus argues, in form of an empirical criticism against Hegel, that the economic and political differences in societies increase under capitalist conditions. Economic self-interest and class-based power rule in civil society and in the state, which renders individuals unfree. The bit lengthy quote here is, "Nobody can be reconciled with a world of sharp contrasts between gated communities and urban ghettos, where the prospect of any substantive social solidarity seems completely obliterated. The political process, which for Hegel was supposed to be the realm of the universal, is today heavily determined by the particular interests of the financial sector, which stands in for civil society at large." Two more quotes. "In the age of the sovereignty of capital, the state, which was supposed to regulate the economy, is itself regulated by the economy. The mentality appropriate to the market has penetrated almost all areas of social life, and the resultant loss of communal bonds can only be compensated by the false universality of virulent nationalism and religious fundamentalism. The affirmative project of the philosophy of right, which aims at proving the rationality of the bourgeois capitalist social order, essentially fails." The conceptual criticism that informs this critique consists in the argument that Hegel actually misapplies his own logic when he tries to do political philosophy. So instead of representing the philosophy of the concept, the logic of the concept, Hegel's description of the state instantiates the logic of essence, according to Abazari. So Abazari argues that the power of capital constitutes and constructs individuals as substance or actuality does in the logic of essence, rather than the logic of concept. This resulting ontology of power, where the power of capital constructs and renders us all dependent, specifically captures the structure of social domination in capitalism. In capitalism, Abazari thus argues, individuals think they are equal. We think we are individuals. We think we have rights. We think we have a legal representation that is on equal footing and so forth. However, this is illusion and shine, also categories from the logic of essence. This illusion of equality becomes a means to continue the domination of individuals under capitalist conditions. So you may think of a false ideology. We're all being told that we are equal and that we are individuals and we are somewhat free in capitalism, but truly we are not. Freedom, that is in line with the logic of the concept that Hegel said he did ground his political philosophy on, but Abazari denies this. True freedom that is compatible with the logic of the concept is impossible under capitalism, according to Abazari. Yeah, so this leads me to the second critique by Frank Ruder. His conceptual criticism of Hegel consists in the notion that Hegel's civil society includes poverty, decadence, and unfree, unethical, and asocial groups. He calls these the poor and the rich rebel. So individuals that are so decadently rich that they don't identify with the ethical order anymore, and individuals that, because of different circumstances in civil society, are so poor that they also fail to identify with the ethical order. The poor rebel wants to be free but cannot be. Hegel's philosophy of right is supposed to be a philosophy of freedom. Therefore, it contradicts itself. It cannot guarantee the freedom it is supposed to guarantee to all individuals. And this shows that Hegel's promise of a free social order fails. Hegel's justice creates injustice. The empirical critique of Ruder consists in the argument that Hegel had not seen, because of his location in time and space and history, Hegel had not seen that this rebel of unethical individuals turns into the self-conscious proletariat, which politically enables a total and radical redesigning of the social order. If this proletariat just becomes self-conscious of its political potentialities, then it is going to bring about a new, more equitable society. The common concerns of both of these authors are thus that both of them reject Hegel's notion that the best possible society and best possible world order still allows for vast economic and political inequalities, for poverty, for decadence, for unemployment, for overproduction, exploitation, war, colonialism, and so forth. These are all part of the philosophy of right, and these authors reject the notion that this is the best we can do as humanity. And both of these authors blame these deficiencies to the rule of the capitalist mode of production. Both authors also agree that Hegel was ideologically compromised by the socio-political and historical circumstances he lived in. They don't necessarily imply that he was in bad faith and just tried to secure his job and social standing in Prussia, but they imply that he actually just thought wrongly because he was conditioned by historical circumstance. As I mentioned, Abazari argues that the science of logic does ground the political philosophy. However, the logic's own claims depend on socio-economic reality. So all philosophy, according to Abazari, depends on historical circumstance, and this includes the science of logic. While Hegel might think that right is grounded on the logic of the concept, it truly channels the logic of essence, as mentioned before, with the power, might that substance or capital has over individuals. The free social order is not possible because the dependence relationship between substance as universal and individuals as us undermines this notion of free self-determination of the individuals. Meanwhile, Frank Ruder argues that politics condition philosophy, implying that had Hegel witnessed the emergence of a class self-conscious proletariat, he could have envisioned a more egalitarian social order. Abazari thus states, the logical categories are not self-standing, but they shadow or track the empirical world, and the empirical world for Hegel is developed in history. The logic does not obtain antecedently to history, but it develops as history develops, which is to say that the logic is constituted by historical experience. The logic of the concept thus points to real freedom, but that kind of freedom in institutional form is only possible after capitalism. This raises, I guess, several problems, especially for orthodox Hegelians. One of them, logically speaking, might be that if the logic depends on capitalism, how is Hegel able to conceive the logic of the concept and its connection to freedom under conditions of early capitalism? One possible answer, and I guess similar criticisms have been leveled against Karl Marx. How is he able to think beyond capitalism given his time and historical location? One possible answer is that Hegel saw the contradictions of capitalism, and he does point them out, and he mentions the problems capitalism has. So he saw these problems. They pointed to a new free order beyond capitalism, but Hegel himself falsely associated capitalism with logical freedom and falsely thought it was already the end of history, and couldn't see a way out of these self-contradictions. Unlike, for example, Fichte, who lived before Hegel and already had a quite different ideal state in mind without many of the negatives that I'd mentioned before. But I'll mention Fichte's alternative a bit later. If it is true that philosophy, including even the logic, depends on history, one could argue, then philosophy becomes a description of what history or politics in a given time and place suggest and what could be otherwise. The modal status of philosophical claims would then not be necessary or, but rather contingent. If all philosophical and non-philosophical thought relies on political and historical conditions, as Azari and Ruder suggest, any critique of Hegel will be so reliant also, which includes his critics. This threatens the normative status of his critics and their critiques. Their perspectives might be only as valid as the particular conditions that determine them. So Hegel could just level the same criticism against them that they level against him. He is conditioned because of his socio-historical position, and so are they. The only criteria left, if philosophical thought depends on conditions, are maybe Kuhn-like coherence, consistency, and the very assumptions that are made from which philosophical conclusions are drawn themselves. Hegel and the critics thus beg the question against each other if this holds true. Under these circumstances, philosophy would only articulate particular differences in thought without an overarching universal and thus a normative criterion. It would be one particular view against another, each supported by a particular circumstance. It seems to me that for these reasons and others, Hegel defines philosophy differently. And this links to the talk before, maybe in a more qualitative manner. Against this view, Hegel describes philosophy as knowledge of unconditioned truth, quote here from the Phenomenology, to help bring philosophy closer to the form of science, to the goal of its being able to give up the name of love of knowledge and become actual knowledge. The knowledge of truth Hegel calls the concept. Here the quote from the Encyclopedia. Since the determinacies of feeling, of intuition, of desire, of willing, and so forth are generally called representations, inasmuch as we have knowledge of them, we can be said in general that philosophy puts thoughts in categories, but more precisely concepts, in the place of representations. So one could say there's a flip. We are in the space of conditioned thought all the way up to representations, but once we manage to philosophically comprehend what informs these representations, we enter the philosophical space of unconditioned truth. We think the concept as origin in itself, independent, self-positing truth that enables all these other lower forms of mental content in the first place. In its most concrete form, this concept that we seek in representations is the idea. Free and genuine thought is inwardly concrete, hence it is idea, and in all its universality, it is the idea. In the philosophy of right, Hegel accordingly argues that he is describing the idea of right with its institutions of personhood, property, contract, morality, family, civil society, and the state. These are all forms of the unconditioned truth of the idea of right, and thus they are self-grounding, self-justifying, and from Hegel's point of view, eternal. This idea then, the idea of right that he describes in the philosophy of right, embodies the same unconditioned concepts that also manifests as time and that enables history. In the philosophy of nature, Hegel deduces time as a form of the concept. Therefore, time is a form of the concept. So the idea that time could condition the concept as it's being reported on is nonsensical. It would be the concept conditioning itself, the concept in its form of time, conditioning the concept itself in the form of for example, right. History is the unfolding of the idea of right in time, according to Hegel. Since the idea of right enables history in the first place, history cannot condition the account of the idea of right. So same idea as with time. The idea of right is that which is ontologically true in order for history to take place. There would be no history in the sense of progress or advancement of freedom if there wasn't the metaphysical, so to speak, idea at play always already. And so, it's impossible that history could condition the idea because the idea causes history in the first place. Particular societies, according to Hegel, manifest unconditioned right or the idea of right in particular ways. Here a quote from the philosophy of right. Right in its positive form, so how the idea of right, for example, manifests itself, acquires a positive element in its content, alpha, through the particular national character of a people, its stage of historical development, and the whole complex of relations connected with the necessities of nature. This is just to show that Yes, the self-grounding, unconditionally true idea of right does manifest in empirical circumstance, but the idea is ontologically first before its manifestation. Hegel also emphasizes in the philosophy of right repeatedly that philosophical descriptions, therefore, are not historical descriptions of right. Here the quote from the paragraph 4. But even if particular determinations of right are both right and reasonable, still it is one thing to prove that they have that character, which cannot be truly done except by means of the concept, and quite another to describe their appearance in history or the circumstances, contingencies, needs, and events which brought about their enactment. Further, philosophy and history are able to preserve an attitude of mutual indifference. The objective manifestation of the idea of right in history thus embodies the idea's unconditionality. Philosophical thinkers are able to describe this unconditioned idea as they manifest the unconditioned truth of the idea of spirit, Hegel calls absolute spirit. Philosophy is thus ultimately, in its conceptual form, unconditioned truth, which is spirit, thinking itself through the thoughts of finite philosophers and comprehending itself unconditionally. So philosophy ultimately, according to the encyclopedia's final definition of what true thought is the unconditioned truth comprehending itself. Hegel calls it here the eternal idea, the idea that is in and for itself, eternally remains active, engenders and enjoys itself as absolute spirit, which manifests itself in the thought of finite philosophizing subjects. All this to say that Hegel methodologically disagrees with both of his neo-Marxist critics, Ruder and Abazari, who seem to ground all thought, including their own, in conditioned and conditioning political and economic reality. Still, within Hegel's own methodology of what philosophy is, the unconditioned truth, thinking itself unconditionally, he could still have committed philosophical error. Hegel himself might thus report on mere representations rather than of the idea of right when he is describing the philosophy of right. So by his own methodological standards, Hegel's own description of the concept of right might be wrong. So Hegel's description of what philosophy is in the encyclopedia just tells us what philosophy does when it succeeds. So it's only when philosophy succeeds that it is unconditioned truth, thinking itself unconditionally. But for us as individuals, it's always possible to fall short of this standard and to not live up to the demand of philosophy being absolute spirit. And this might, of course, obviously apply to Hegel himself. So Hegel's concept of philosophical error would be Hegel has just reported on representations instead of actually capturing the concept of right. So this kind of methodological background allows, I would argue, for two kinds of Hegelian responses to the earlier mentioned critiques. The first response, from the Hegelian perspective, simply assumes that the philosophy of right does indeed describe the unconditionally true idea of right. So under this perspective, we would say, okay, Hegel actually did manage to capture the concept, or we hope, or we assume he captured the concept. So if we just take the position of the philosophy of right as Hegel wrote it, what could he argue against these kind of Marxist critiques? I would say I would call this maybe flamboyantly the dogmatic way of responding to neo-Marxist critiques. And it has been done a lot, and it's being done. So people don't seem, from a Hegelian perspective, not always want to make proper concept-based arguments against critiques of Hegel. But they just seem to more or less repeat what Hegel said. And I think this is not really in the spirit of what philosophy should be. We should think for ourselves and try to channel the concept ourselves, as we might spectacularly fail in doing so, but we should try. But anyway, this first dogmatic way of rejecting this criticism simply entails, I now repeat the content of the philosophy of right very quickly, just to give you an idea of what an orthodox dogmatic Hegelian might answer. Abstract right is the idea of right in immediate form, morality is the idea of right in reflective form, and ethical life is the concrete universality of the idea of right. Ethical life more specifically then manifests as the family, as the immediate individual identity of its particular members, civil society where family interests, personal interests, and the state's universal interests collide in the form of particular interests. So it's kind of the site of struggle where the state fights against the particular interests of civil society actors, individuals, and families. But obviously, with the goal of harmonizing everything and keeping things more or less stable. And finally, the state as site of the universal interest. By definition, the rational state for Hegel pursues the universal interest only, which includes the protection and instrumentalization of family and civil society. So people have noted the state has a bit of an ambivalent relationship to family and the economic sphere. So on the one hand, the state is very interested in protecting these institutions and making them function in order to create value and basically material for its own continued existence. At the same time, the state will use these institutions when it sees fit. So the state will use the family and its children, for example, in case of war, but also the economy when need be, when the state's interests are under threat or when the state is on a mission to pursue its universal interests, it just uses what it protects. The state's tasks, according to Hegel, include protection of the family's individuality, the prevention of civil society's self-destruction, which the Marxist critics deny the state is able to do. How can the self-destruction of civil society take place? Some examples include a lack of consumer and employee protection, a lack of coordination of production through a sector, for example, through sector and company-specific subsidies, the rise of monopolies, and so forth. So we've seen a lot of these events play out also in our lifetime. The state is in charge of making sure that these self-destructive economic mechanisms do not get out of control and undermine their own ability to exist. At the same time, and maybe problematically, the state also has to fight its own corruption and its own inefficiencies. If you ever have dealt with a German bureaucracy, you will know what I'm talking about, especially in the last 10 years for some reason. Yeah, the state is supposed to ensure that it is not corrupt, it itself is not corrupt and inefficient, which of course is problematic given that this corruption can go all the way up to the institutions that are supposed to take care of it. For example, corruption by lobbies, party networks, economic interests, even family interests that manage to get hold of key positions in the political sphere, the bureaucracy in general, and so forth. Hegel also concedes, though, and this might be also used as an argument against neo-Marxist critiques, that the best possible empirically manifest state will be imperfect. So there's no empirically perfect manifestation of the idea of right. Corruption and inefficiency are therefore, according to Hegel, inevitable. And this is due to the ways in which the concept of right judges and syllogizes itself, so how it manifests itself in order to give itself empirical form. In the logic of the concept, Hegel differentiates between several different forms of judgment and syllogism, and these all lead to more or less perfect forms of manifestation of this idea of right. These are ultimately, I guess, the logical reason why empirical states are imperfect, but they are inevitable. Hegel thus concedes that all empirical states will be inefficient and corrupt to some degree. However, Hegel argues this does not betray an error in the concept of the state as the site of universal interest. So just because empirical states are not able to always live up to their own demand of being really universality-oriented, just because they failed in doing so does not mean that the concept of the state as a pursuant of universal interest is somewhat wrong, philosophically speaking. So this entails for Hegel that even the best possible state will include a civil society which includes, and this is, for example, what Ruder finds so offensive, the best possible society includes poverty, inequality, overproduction, unemployment, and the aforementioned rich and poor rebel. Also, according to Hegel, it will entail emigration, for example, in the form of colonialism. And internationally speaking, there's no world order for Hegel without particular states waging some kind of war against other particular states, and this includes military conflict, so culture wars, economic wars, and so forth. That's not existential enough. It has to be military war. The state has to be, in principle, confronted with its own demise in existential terms. Otherwise, it doesn't know what it is, i.e. a particular sovereign political entity. The often contingent, inefficient, and anti-egalitarian consequences of a regulated but relatively free civil society for Hegel are thus a byproduct of individual particular interest and choice formation that also entail greater degrees of, for the individuals in civil society, greater degrees of pressure, motivation, ambition, creativity and self-realization, but also the price of freedom, more egotism, asocial activity, decadence, crime, unnecessary desires, and so forth. So these are all things Hegel is willing to accept. He says this is the bullet we have to bite in order to unleash creativity and self-determination. And he is aware, also engaging with Fichte's writings, that another society is possible, is just not desirable for Hegel. So the alternative, Hegel, for example, was writing against in his day, which is older than the philosophy of right, is Fichte's closed commercial state. For example, Fichte was also very offended by the notion of poverty and inequality, unemployment, and so forth. So he had an alternative vision, one might maybe call a proto-socialist utopia. He called it the closed commercial state, with a heavily planned economy, assignment of professions, state-regulated production and consumption, minimal trade to avoid international competition. Fichte's state closes its borders to foreign trade, confines commerce to its citizens to prevent exploitation and to ensure internal equity. The government in Fichte's state regulates production, distribution, pricing, labor division amongst the states that he calls producers, artisans, and merchants. So we cannot choose what we're going to be. It's one of those three, and the state decides for you. But this kind of mechanism, Fichte is convinced, ensures everybody's livelihood. So that's a more heavily regulated socialist, one might say today, alternative. Hegel had in mind when he was trying to defend his notion of civil society with greater degrees of contingency, particularity, and so forth. So this is what Hegel rejected. So what does the dogmatic Hegelian response to the Marxist critics include further? Hegel argues that every determination of right implies its own negation all the way up to world spirit. So he does concede some of the criticisms made by neo-Marxists in his own writing already. For example, he argues that abstract right, the institution of abstract right, necessarily implies crime. So you cannot have the notion and the institution of private property, contract, and personhood without crime denying these. So people, as soon as we have persons in a society, they will be killed. As soon as we have property, it will be stolen. As soon as we have contract, they will be broken, necessarily, according to Hegel. I like to argue controversially, maybe. Hegel argues we can't have morality without having evil. So as soon as people start thinking for themselves and being responsible for their notion of the good and then pursuing this notion, error is inevitable. So some of us will just necessarily be wrong about what the good is, and therefore we will commit acts of evil, even against our best intentions. The unity of the family that Hegel describes necessarily implies its own dissolution. So the children have to, at some point, become individuals and, in a sense, disrupt their relationship to the parents, often in a probably all too ungrateful manner, I've been told by some parents. So the family unity has to dissolve. And civil society, as I mentioned, despite all of the creation of wealth and the distribution of goods that it affects, also brings about poverty, decadence, inequality, and these phenomena. Finally, as mentioned already as well, the state's particularity. We can't have a sovereign state without competition between this state and other states, which also includes sabotage, espionage, war, and these kind of things. So you can't have the good of a sovereign particular state without having the negative side of these factors. But that's so the state, against what has been argued before, is not the final court of arbitration for Hegel. The ultimate side of objective spirit is a world spirit. So the state is not the end of history in a sense. I think world spirit should be called the end of history, because world spirit just uses particular states for the pursuit of its own interests. So states use the family and civil society, but the states, the particular states that exist, they are being used by world spirit. So the ultimate side of right is world spirit, not the particular state. It is this world spirit, Hegel says, that uses the particularities of particular states and individuals. The quote from the philosophy of right is, "In the course of this activity of the world spirit, which is also world history, states, peoples, and individuals arise animated by the particular determinate principle, which has its exposition and actuality in their constitutions and in the whole range of their life and condition. But ultimately, all individuals, in particulars in the political realm, are, one could say, tools or means for the pursuit of freedom by world spirit. This includes states' economic deficiencies, competition, and conflict. All of these are used to advance freedom. So ultimately, Hegel, in a sense, provides a justification for the failure of civil society to avoid poverty, to avoid emigration, to avoid colonialism, and so forth, because it says, yeah, the individual state, the particular state, might not be able to take care of these economic problems, but ultimately, these serve the greater good of world spirit's advancement towards freedom. So, for example, colonialism has been debated, and economic warfare, competition, and so forth. All of these are ultimately just means to the end of the global advancement of freedom. The state's particularity thus entail global conflicts that ultimately serve an often non-linear development towards freedom as the bearer of world spirit's right. So this is also not, although I guess statistically speaking, globally levels of wealth are rising and so forth, Hegel would say that world spirit is not necessarily interested in making sure that the whole world advances together, but is mostly interested in one specific culture at a given time to dominate world affairs and to continue its own specific march towards freedom in its own specific way. The other countries and zones of culture and so forth might piggyback on this one individual culture and follow it into freedom, or they might not. That is contingent from the world spiritual point of view. Yeah. So nevertheless, that's the dogmatic view. That's what a dogmatic Hegelian would answer, I would say, to the Marxist critique. So he would reject this notion that there's a justified moral or ethical outrage with the failure of certain institutions in Hegel's state, because Hegel says, in the end of the day, they are justified because of the workings of world spirit. And nevertheless, despite this argumentation that a dogmatic Hegelian might give, Hegel's own account of right has been challenged on the grounds of his own method. So there are thinkers, for example, Klaus Viehweg or Richard in Winfield, who have argued even if we subscribe to Hegelian method of justification, we should achieve a different concept of right. We should get to different conclusions about what a rational social order looks like. So, for example, world historical, states' internal and theoretical developments after Hegel's time can thus inform representations that suggest a different and final shape of the concept of right is possible. So Hegel just wasn't able to think these representations that thinkers like Viehweg and Winfield are able to think, and therefore Hegel wasn't able to get to the concept through the representations he had available, whereas Winfield and Viehweg are able to get to the concept because their representations enable them to get there. One could call these liberal progressive critics. They argue against Hegel for example, they said in a rational, updated notion of right, we have to replace monarchy by a presidential or parliamentary democracy. We have to challenge the classical family structure. So it's not just the husband earning money outside of the home, whereas the wife stays at home. Instead, we have both partners earning, or maybe just one of them, or we have even same-sex marriages or institutions that don't call themselves family, but serve the same reproductive purposes that traditional families have served. Also, the problems of civil society that Hegel calls overproduction, underconsumption, and unemployment can be, some people argue, maybe there will be some mentioning in the Q&A, can be prevented or at least heavily diminished by measures undertaken by the modern state. For example, progressive monetary policy that in mysterious ways deals with, for me, deals with inflation and deflation, a more heavy focus on export, for example, the rise of the finance sector. Some people associate actually as a positive destruction, creation, and distribution of wealth, more credit-based consumption and so forth. Yeah, these are all measures that can be used. Some economists argue in order to undermine the problem of poverty and the problem of inequality. They also reject the formation of a rebel. They think a rebel can be prevented by social welfare, employment programs, progressive taxation, and so forth. One may think of Scandinavian countries that have high levels of taxation, therefore prevent maybe overtly excessive sizes of rich and poor rebel. Hegel's corporations are usually replaced by unions, employer and trade associations, political parties, and so forth. Richard Dean Winfield argues for this quite substantially. Hegel's collective voting is replaced by one citizen, one vote to make it more democratic. Two non-directly elected chambers proposed by Hegel are replaced by elected chambers. Also, the problem of overpopulation and emigration that Hegel is committed to can be prevented by voluntary family planning, population decrease, which is what we're seeing in many countries nowadays anyway, whereas the lack of labor due to lack of children is offset by immigration and or technological advances in production. This is the progressive critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. There's a conservative critique, which I personally have heard at one conference in Germany once, and this conservative critique is very rare, and it argues the problem with Hegel is his theory of the estates, and we should replace Hegel's estates with the estates of the church, the nobility, crown, and peasants. But it is being argued. It's a published paper, but yeah, it's rare. Also, the increasing interstate political dependence and trade, some people argue, progressives argue, can be dealt with in the form of increasingly influential international institutions, United Nations, regional forces, Mercosur, African Union, and so forth, whereas a nuclear stalemate helps at least to make war amongst highly developed political states less likely. Given momentary political circumstances, this is maybe not the most convincing argument, but yeah, ultimately, in the long run, ideally, wars will be obsolete and or impossible due to the existential consequences. So yeah, this would be a liberal update of Hegel's philosophy of right. However, for the Marxist critics that I mentioned in the beginning, this wouldn't be good enough. These corrections are not sufficiently fundamental for the critics such as Abazari and Ruda, as these reforms of the philosophy of right do not change the capitalist character of Hegel's account of the economy and politics. They maintain, the critics is, that Hegel's state is unable to stabilize and enact universal interest against capitalist civil society's particularity. The state's universality cannot embed civil society's particularity of interest, which undermines the capitalist state's ability to pursue the universal interest. So as long as you keep the economy running under capitalist measures, it is inevitable from the Marxist perspective that the state's universal orientation will be corrupted and ultimately particular interest will take hold of it. This raises the question, given that the Marxist critics so radically reject the liberal reform of Hegel's concept of right, whether there's any common ground between Marxist critics and Hegel himself. And this is what I would like to suggest, and this is very open-ended and undefined, that maybe there's a way in which one can stick to the Hegelian method of thinking and try and track the concept of right as proposed in the philosophy of right without clinging on to the concrete institutional shapes in such a way that one can extend an, say, olive branch to contemporary Marxist critics and invite them to give us an alternative concept of right given their institutional focus, which we can then compare, contrast, and think through ourselves in order to find who is more correct about the shape of right, Hegel or his critics or his liberal reformers. Okay, so in order to avoid methodological self-contradiction, one can adhere to Hegel's notion that political philosophy describes the unconditioned truth of the idea of right, but one can argue for different institutions. This would imply neutrality regarding the respective merits of Hegel's and of his critics' perspectives. Thinking through concretely existing socio-political and economic institutions along the concept's moments, as well as Hegel's and neo-Marxism's representations of an ideal social order, should reveal to which degree the idea of right is found or manifest in reality and in representational thought. The resulting account of right would have to be philosophically proven to be superior to its rivals by showing that it describes the concept of right and its stages, as well as their connections correctly by way of systematic argumentation. This new concept of right, or neo-Marxist concept of right, one could argue, thus has to track the concept of right's moments of immediacy, individuality, mediation, differences and interplay between particularity, universality, and individuality, so typical of civil society, and of their unity, which is the concrete universal Hegel associates with the state. So any new alternative concept of right has to live up to the logical requirements of the concept of right in general, but it can, in a way, fulfill these requirements with different kind of institutional arrangements. The concept of right thus remains the criterion of thought and deduction, while its content is open for redefinition. This would be compatible with Abazari's notion that a truly free order must be based on the logic of the concept. Doing this would avoid the relativistic consequences of Ruda's and Abazari's conditionality-implying methods. It would also bypass the incompatibility issues of Hegel's account of right that it has with contemporary socio-political reality. Since this new method connects the concept's moments and transitions to concrete institutions, it also provides a universal criterion for evaluation and deduction without falling into logical formalism. This project of a logically sound Marxist alternative account of right would go beyond the projects of both Abazari and Ruda. They just retreat to a conceptual analysis, but they don't tell us concretely what kind of society they would prefer compared to Hegel's. What concrete institutions could such a non-dogmatic, non-relativist Marxist account of right to Hegel's account propose? And there are several neo-Marxist social scientists arguing for the installment of concrete institutions. I'm just going to give a short overview over what is possible according to such thinkers, without too much trying to shape the alternative concept of right that they could be included in. But yeah, contemporary Marxist thinkers propose, for example, the following institutions: that all jobs are designed in a combination of empowering and rote tasks, that compensation for work starts from an equal share of the social product, and then there are some qualifications here, that it is adjusted for effort, sacrifice, and undesirable conditions, as rated by peers. So there's a heavily democratic element to rewarding people for their work. It also rejects this new method of distributing social wealth, would also reject luck, inheritance, or output, with exceptions for disabilities, childcare, and retirement. This is proposed by Robin Harnell and Eric Wright. Essentials like healthcare and education would be entirely free. Annual economic planning would involve proposals from worker and consumer councils. Proposals integrate environmental and social costs that are all made in a democratically reasonable fashion. And aggregate investment is democratically allocated based on social needs. Both authors mention the installment of conversion funds. These are publicly funded loans to facilitate the transformation of traditional capitalist firms into cooperatives. So they don't necessarily want a revolution and a violent restructuring of the economy, but they propose models of phasing out capitalist modes of production and replacing them slowly by initially state-led initiatives, later then in a state-less manner. They call preferential procurement policies that governments and public institutions prioritize purchases from cooperatives to create market advantages in this interim period. They also both propose social cooperatives which are community-owned enterprises that provide essential services such as healthcare, education, or renewable energy on a non-profit basis, and which are managed by users and workers alike. There's also much talk of unconditional basic income, which is a regular unconditional cash payment to all citizens, regardless of their employment status. And there's participatory budgeting, which is a process where citizens directly allocate a portion of public budgets, 10 to 20% is mentioned, through assemblies, deliberations, and voting. What are the conceptual goals of neo-Marxist institutions such as these. The family, they argue, may remain the site of reproduction and personal education of the children, for example, but it is opened to avoid dependencies, hierarchies, paternalism, and so forth. Some talk of collective child-rearing alternatives to be provided by the state. Civil society experiences the greatest changes. Overall, the goal is to limit contingency and particularity in this sphere. Most authors demand more equality to avoid the accumulation of power and wealth in the hands of few. They want more democracy as well, establishing of more direct democratic models of economic organization, regulation, and production. They do want to prevent the ills of capitalism, i.e. The furtherance of greed, unnecessary desire formation, and so forth, overconsumption as well, of course, and environmental destruction. And overall, they aim for less economic pressure on individuals. The incentives to work for individuals are supposed to be less external and existential, but more intrinsic and voluntary. In the beginning, the state is an interim tool for the creation of a more democratic society of political decision-making, where political decision-making is more directly linked to citizens' interests and life experiences. And finally and ultimately, the state, the classical state, is replaced by democratic councils, cooperatives, and assemblies, and so forth. These consequences include, I would say, from a logical point of view, that the individual family becomes potentially more particularized, opened. Family members might be collectively educated, or parents might decide for open families and so forth. Civil society becomes less particular and contingent and more equitable in terms of wealth creation and distribution. Representation of particular interests becomes more democratic. Of course, there are efficiency considerations to make. And finally, the universal interest is defined in a more direct democratic manner than in Hegel's philosophy of right or in the liberal interpretations of it, which also might lead to more particularization of the political decision-making process. So this then concludes the survey of neo-Marxist institutional alternatives. To close the circle to the beginning, while Avazari and Ruder, the neo-Marxist critics mentioned in the beginning, do not provide concrete institutional alternatives to Hegel's account of right, contemporary Marxist social scientists do describe such institutions. Still, an alternative Marxist concept of right still has to articulate the conceptual stages of individuality, mediation, and concrete universality if it is to live up to Hegel's logical modalities of argumentation. Whether and if so, these Marxist alternatives are compatible with the demands of the concept of right is a task uniquely fit for philosophy rather than for social science. While most Marxist proposals are either focused on democracy and thus particularity or on equality, are focused on equality, Abazari seems to favor the former, Ruder the latter. Whether Hegel's own, a liberal Hegelian or a neo-Marxist account of right is more rationally attractive is best settled by systematic philosophical argumentation. Thank you.